Throughout time, the planet has shaped all life.
The planet has shaped all life.
The planet has shaped all life.
But now, in the era of the human, we are shaping the planet.
And truthfully, we are not doing a good job at it yet. Our actions are putting a lot of pressure on the world. Just look at 2020 with COVID-19, extreme weather, and rampant wildfires. People have created this mess, but we can fix it.
Empowered people can become agents of their own destiny. The world may seem stuck in its own ways, but we can take actions to create a new normal, whether that's expanding the role of women in society or using cleaner energy.
In too many countries, fossil fuels remain the primary source of energy, but clean alternatives like solar power will help reduce our carbon emissions. These alternatives need to be made accessible and affordable without using too much of other finite resources.
And we must learn to harness the power of nature at the same time as we protect its beauty and wonder. Moving to protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems in a way that promotes well-being.
Too often, the decisions of a few people or countries hurt the most vulnerable people across the world. For all of us to flourish now and into the future, we must understand that we are all connected. The choices you make impact the whole world around you.
Shaping the planet means
Taking bold steps.
Bold steps for humans to survive and thrive in this new era.
If we are going to change the world,
we need you.
We need you.
We need you, our global leaders, to take bold action now.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good afternoon and many thanks for joining us today for the presentation in Geneva of the latest UNDP Human Development Report entitled The Next Frontier, Human Development and the Anthropocene. 30 years ago, UNDP issued its first Human Development Report, challenging the primacy of growth as the measure of progress. Its core message was that human beings are at the center of development, that income and growth were means to acquire well-being and not ends in themselves. So development was more than gross domestic product. Development was about the process of enlarging human choices so people could do and be what they valued in life. The first Human Development Report also proposed a new index, which offered a simple measure of the basic issues valued by everybody around the world and empowering persons to pursue their own path in life. And these were a long and healthy life, a basic education, and money to acquire services and goods. Today, we can say that the human development concept revolutionized development practice. It led to new national and global policies to reduce poverty and achieve social justice that led to an unprecedented progress in human well-being across the world. 30 years on, however, it's also unquestionably evident that Earth has been taken to the brink. The next frontier of human development demands to continue advancing human well-being while erasing planetary pressures, because planet and people are interdependent. And for this reason, they must be brought together as part of the same agenda. How can they be integrated? We're extremely pleased that even in the context of the COVID pandemic, UNDP Human Development Report Office took up the challenge and has offered an alternative way of thinking paths of human progress, also accounting for the dangerous pressures we put on the planet. They have presented us with a new thought-provoking analysis on how to jumpstart the process and a new experimental metrics to adjust human development to planetary pressures. To take forward this conversation, UNDP is already working on the ground in more than 130 countries and in partnership with United Nations sister agencies, providing integrated support that goes beyond quick and siloed technical fixes, accelerating the transition towards greener and more equitable development paths. And we're also engaging with partners across the world in exchanges that would enrich further the discussion as we're doing here in Geneva today. I'm particularly honored to be on this virtual stage with world-renowned experts who will share with us their thoughts on the findings of the report and their perspectives on how to forge a new pact between humans and planet. We will first hear from Mrs. Tatiana Valovaya, Director General of the United Nations Office in Geneva, who will provide opening remarks. Then Pedro Conceição, Director of the Human Development Report Office at UNDP and its lead author, who will make a presentation on the key data and findings of the report. And in the second part of the event, we will have an interactive discussion moderated by Kasmira Jeffert, Editor-in-Chief of Geneva Solutions. And in the panel, we'll feature Ambassador Nasat Shamin Khan, President of the Human Rights Council, Stuart McKinnon, Global Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Group at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and Peter Bakker, President and Chief Executive Officer of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Sincere thanks to all for accepting our invitation to this event. In order to allow for all participants to engage, we have an interactive tool with a questions and answer chat box. We encourage active participation and as many questions as possible, and they will be answered in the second part of this event. Without further ado, let me pass the floor to Her Excellency, Director General of United Nations Office in Geneva, Mrs. Tatiana Valovaya. Over to you.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, my great pleasure to be with you today for the presentation of 2020 UNDP Human Development Report. This year, we are marking the 30th anniversary of the report. 30 years ago, when the Human Development Index was first published, many of today's challenges were already looming in the horizon. The growing power of the internet upended the world, environmental consciousness began to grow, and the geopolitical climate entered an era of deep uncertainty. Since then, humanity has made significant progress. In terms of human development, notable improvement had been made in reducing child and maternal mortality, increasing women's representation, or expanding access to education and energy. However, the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated socio-economic crisis are wiping out many of these advancements. After years of progress, poverty and hunger are on the rise. In addition, we are putting past achievements at risk by taking our planet for granted. The climate and environmental emergency are the defining issues of our time, and they affect us all without exception. As United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently stated, with 1 million species at risk of extinction and whole ecosystems disappearing before our eyes, we are waging a war on nature, a war with no winners. It is of utmost urgency that governments and people understand in their very DNA that all environmental, social, and economic challenges are interlinked. In that regard, the latest Human Development Report provides a visionary take on development, and I would like to congratulate the authors on this undertaking and on this interdependence of people and nature. The report characterized our era as Anthropocene, the age of human impact. The report makes a compelling case for a global transition out of the current unsustainable pattern of production and consumption. 2021 must be the year to reconcile humanity with nature and get the Sustainable Development Goals agenda back on track. The era of the Anthropocene requires new metrics of progress, where the pressure we put on the planet is no longer hidden. This year, experimental Human Development Index adjusts for planetary pressure and helps to recalibrate how nations should assess their progress. And as a result, more than 50 countries drop out of the very high human development group, reflecting their dependence on fossil fuels and material footprint. I would like to say that it's a very important achievement and very interesting and thought-breaking undertaking. The upcoming UN Biodiversity Conference and the UN Climate Conference are key milestones to commit to reversing species and ecosystems loss and achieving carbon neutrality. The UN Secretary Guterres has repeatedly stressed that we need to achieve global carbon neutrality within the next 3 decades, align global finances behind the Paris Agreement, phase out subsidies that destroy our ecosystems, and scale up nature-based solutions. The United Nations Development System is working diligently on the ground to embed environmental sustainability in all national response plans. With political will, smart politics, and the tight investments, we can chart on a path that brings health to all, revives economies, builds resilience, and rescues biodiversity. To accelerate this necessary transformation, the Human Development Report rightly points out that we need accountable institutions that create the needed incentives for change. Given the interconnectedness of our world, I firmly believe that strong multilateral institutions and multi-stakeholder collaborations are the only viable solution. Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to listening to today's debates linking New York and the international Geneva community around this important report. While human activity can harm nature, it can also regenerate. The rights of present and future generations depend on healthy environment. The moment to act is now. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Director General. Let me now invite Pedro Conceição for the presentation of the report.
Thank you, Maria Luisa. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to present and discuss the 2020 HDR. It's a pleasure to have listened to Mrs. Valovaya, kind words, and to be joining with all of you excellencies and friends for the debate that is to come, which is probably the most important thing. As Maria Luisa mentioned, this was a special report because it came 30 years after the publication of the very first Human Development Report, which introduced both the concept and a new metric, the Human Development Index, to evaluate policies and assess development progress. And in fact, the report starts with a very short but wonderful text by Amartya Sen, paying tribute to the visionary leadership of Mahbub-ul Haq, both in the formulation of the concept as well as introduction of the index. So I would invite you to read that text, even if you choose to ignore the rest of the report, but that text I think is very important. So let me just highlight 3 key messages of the 2020 HDR, and many of the things I will say will echo both the words of Maria Luisa, Ms. Valovaya, as well as the video that you heard at the beginning of the presentation. First key message is that the 2020 Human Development Report can be seen as an invitation to look at challenges such as COVID-19, the climate emergency, not as separate problems, but as a reflection of something underlying all of them, which results from the unprecedented moment in our history, in human history, but also in the history of our planet. This is a moment when human pressures are driving dangerous change at the planetary scale. So this is not local environmental damage or regional environmental damage, but changes that are happening at the planetary scale that are posing risks to us humans, but also to all life on the planet. This is indeed been described as a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, even though the formal designation of the Anthropocene is still open-ended. But the point that we emphasize in the report is that this new moment is bringing unprecedented risks that are of our own making. And COVID-19 may, as I alluded to, be an illustration of this kind of risks. Now, we don't know for sure, but it's likely that the virus has jumped from animals to humans. But we do know that there has been an increase in the frequency of zoonotic diseases, meaning diseases where the pathogen jumps from animals to humans. And we know that this is also tied to these planetary pressures. So the 2020 HDR attempts to reflect on the goal of expanding human development, which animates the Human Development Reports as we go deeper into this new context of the Anthropocene. Now, the second key message is that we are not only facing these new risks, a new type of risks, but they are actually superimposed on a world with large and often growing inequalities. And when these risks materialize in shocks, they can actually further exacerbate these inequalities. So if we take COVID-19, we know that the economic impact has been worse for women than for men. This in part because women are overrepresented in some of the economic sectors that have been hit hardest, but also because expectations about the role of women in homework and childcare appear to be reasserting themselves, leading many women to pull back from the labor force. So you see on this graph that in some countries, there's been a drop of as much as 10 percentage points in the labor force participation rate of women. And this, as you see from the graph, represents a reversal of progress that had taken decades to achieve. But actually, this pattern holds more broadly. So you see on the left that countries that face more ecological threats, droughts, floods, storms, are also those where gender inequality is higher. And the graph on the slide shows that if we consider inequality in human development more broadly, the story is very much the same. Now, inequalities are also linked to gaps in consumption and in power between those that over-extract and over-pollute and those bearing the consequences of these actions. So we report that by the end of this century, as you can see by the red lines on this graph, the poorest countries in the world, who have contributed the least to climate change, could experience up to 100 days more of extreme temperature, while the rich countries, which contributed the most historically, could actually experience 18 days less of extreme temperature. But as the blue lines show, those 100 days could also be cut in half. By getting closer to meeting the aspirations of the Paris Agreement on climate change. So what happens going forward is not inevitable and depends on our choices. And this brings me to the third and final key message of the report. Human development is not only about people's well-being, it's also about seeing people as agents of change. And so this calls for giving people conditions to make different choices. And in the 2020 HDR, we supplemented the Human Development Index with a new index of planetary pressures, combining indicators of material footprint and carbon dioxide per person. So on the chart that you see, we've plotted the current values of these two indices for all countries in this two-dimensional graph, the blue dots. And it shows that the aspirational space of high human development and low planetary pressures is now empty, the sort of flashing triangle on the right-hand side. So to take us there, the report lays out 3 mechanisms to encourage people to make different choices. First, harnessing social norms. Much policy analysis is premised on the idea that each person is an island making rational calculations on how to behave, but we know that humans are actually an ultra-social species. Therefore, a key predictor on the choices that people make, people's behavior, is what others around them do and expect them to do. So we've seen how quickly social norms around things like using masks can change. And the report suggests that we now must seek to harness also social norms to give greater weight to easing planetary pressures. We emphasize in the report several mechanisms through which these different social norms can be triggered, but we emphasize in particular the role of education. Education here broadly understood as important to enhance both a sense of stewardship for nature, but also the critical thinking that is fundamental for reasoned public and individual deliberation. Second, it's important to harness prices and regulation to shift economic incentives. Carbon prices and the removal of fossil fuel subsidies are examples. But the report suggests that this is not enough. We do need to get regulation right and prices to send the right signals, but it's important also to invest, to do investments, particularly in research, technology, and innovation. We know that many existing technologies, for instance, when it comes to renewable energy, are now competitive and could be deployed at scale with stronger incentives. But what we suggest, it's more important to not put the emphasis on particular technological fixes, but to continue to invest in science, in research, to harness what has been called our collective brain, to continue to expand the frontier of knowledge. In fact, we know from history that what often seems like a wonderful technological fix can bring about unintended consequences. The use of CFCs that enabled the miracle of refrigeration in the first half of the 21st century that transformed our food systems is an example, because it contributed, we found out late in the past century, to the ozone layer. And in a way, that's the same story with fossil fuels. With fossil fuels also, again, a miracle technology, but now we understand it's contributing to climate change. So again, it's important to invest in science, but also in social sciences and humanities to together help us to navigate this new reality that has been described as the Anthropocene. The report also looks at financial markets, and in particular to the role of some financial intermediaries, such as asset owners and asset managers, given their outsized role in current financial markets. For instance, in the United States, asset managers increased their share of ownership of firms in the S&P 500 from less than 1% in 1990 to over 10% today. So these entities can have a very large influence on corporate governance, on issues such as disclosure of climate risk, for instance, and the actions that firms take to mitigate them. Now, climate change may result in economic and financial losses not only to businesses, but also households. Think, for instance, of what happened to falling home values in flood-prone areas. and even governments. So it's not surprising to see that financial regulators are requiring more climate risk assessment, and even central banks are incorporating risk climate in some of their macroprudential oversight of the financial system. And we have a number of contributions in our report in this area. And let me conclude with the third area to encourage people to make different choices. This is the idea, and we'll hear more during the panel, about looking at nature not as a constraint, but actually as a potential opportunity to advance human development by protecting and restoring ecosystems. This is, in the end, what our administrator Achim Steiner calls our ecological infrastructure that stands along with our physical infrastructure and upon ultimately our lives depend upon. So this includes protecting and restoring forests or investing in the blue economy of our oceans. So these are examples that show how preserving ecosystem integrity can also provide long-lasting economic opportunities. So let me come to the end. I want to do it by coming back to the point about inequalities that I alluded to earlier. Or what we call in the report social imbalances. Because inequalities matter not only in terms of resources, but also in power and in voice. And these are the inequalities that often stand in the way of having these mechanisms of change that I described acted upon or implemented. For example, we show in the report to illustrate the magnitude of these asymmetries that the contribution of indigenous peoples to manage forests that we know can work as a carbon sink, therefore mitigating climate change, on a per person basis is roughly equivalent to the carbon dioxide emissions also per person of the top 1% of the global income distribution. And these indigenous peoples are the very people that are often marginalized, persecuted around the world. So these are the imbalances that are seemingly putting people and planet on a collision course, but it does not have to be that way. We can make different choices. It's our aspiration that the 2020 Human Development Report will provide some signposts to continue to advance human development while easing planetary pressures and moving us towards meeting the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So looking very much forward to the panel, to the comments. Let me hand over to Kazmira for the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro, for sharing those findings, which we'll get into more detail in a second. And I'm delighted to be moderating the second part of this event, where we'll be taking your questions, so from the audience. But before we do so, we'd like to invite our esteemed panelists to share their reflections on the report, starting with Ambassador Khan. So, Ambassador Khan, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Excellencies, colleagues, Bula Vinaka, as we say in Fiji, and good day. First of all, I'd like to thank the United Nations Development Programme and the Human Development Report Office for organizing this event for the official presentation in Geneva of this important report. And I would also like to congratulate the UNDP on the fact that this is the 30th anniversary edition of the report. So it's not just an important publication, it's an enduring publication. So many congratulations. Dear colleagues, the 2020 Human Development Report explores an important topic, and that is the impact of human activity on the environment and how those impacts in turn impact us. So not only is this an important topic, it's a timely topic. Indeed, the report notes that the COVID-19 pandemic is a chance for societies to reevaluate norms and for policymakers to take spirited steps towards social and economic recoveries that invest in healthier, greener, more equitable futures, ones that expand human freedoms while easing planetary pressures. So it's for this reason especially that I'm honored to speak to you all today and to participate in this panel. We have this opportunity in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic to redefine our relationship with the environment in a way that also promotes and protects human rights. In this regard, the report provides valuable insights into the connection between human rights and the environment that are especially valuable. And I quote again from the report: supporting the agency and empowerment of disadvantaged populations by respecting their human rights, increasing their access to resources, and ensuring that they are represented and their voices are heard can break the vicious cycle of planetary and social imbalances. Dear colleagues, the 2020 Human Development Report's insights regarding human rights is closely linked to the work of the Human Rights Council, beginning with the recognition that the human rights of persons in vulnerable environmental situations require particular attention during the COVID-19 pandemic. During the first lockdown last spring, the Council adopted by consensus a President's statement that recognized the wide range of human rights implications of the pandemic. Through this PRSD, as we call it, the Council emphasized the importance of timely, equitable, and unhindered access to medicines, vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics, including for persons affected by natural disasters or climate change. Further, the Council mandated the High Commissioner for Human Rights to prepare a report on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the enjoyment of human rights around the world, including good practices. The High Commissioner presented this report to the Council during the 46th session, which we have just concluded, and I was very pleased to see that it included a number of recommendations relating to the protection of environmental rights in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recovery from it. These recommendations included ensuring that any new investments to relaunch economies are in accordance with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, as well as ensuring that all COVID-19 recovery policies accelerate the transition to zero-emission economies in a manner that contributes to the realization of all human rights. It is indeed true that human history is filled with natural cataclysms, conflicts, and many other sorts of crises. But you would also agree with me that climate change and the COVID pandemic are among the worst scourges of our time. Ironically, they share the same common factor of indistinctly affecting rich and poor countries, but with vulnerable populations suffering the most unfair and negative impacts. They also constitute major obstacles to fully guaranteeing respect for the right to a decent standard of living and the right to development, and they deprive populations of the enjoyment of their fundamental rights. Climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic affect us all, but we are not impacted equally, as we do not have the same financial, technical, and human means to face these crises and to protect ourselves. It is therefore with a view towards social justice and human dignity that we must continue advocating for a global economic recovery plan that matches up to the extent of the challenges while placing respect for and the protection of human rights at its core. As the world begins to emerge from the pandemic, the revitalization of our societies must be done in a human rights-based and environmentally conscious manner. Fortunately, the Human Rights Council has been addressing the intersection between human rights and the environment for some time. For example, since 2014, the Council has adopted annual resolutions specifically on human rights and climate change. Each year, this resolution takes a different thematic human rights focus, which have ranged from the adverse impact of climate change on the right to development to the importance of integrating a gender-responsive approach into climate policy. The resolution adopted by the Council last July focused on the adverse impact of climate change on the full and effective enjoyment of human rights by older persons. And since the outbreak of COVID-19, the Human Rights Council, including its special procedure mandate holders, have shone a light on the intersection between the environment, the COVID-19 pandemic, and human rights. As an example, last September, the Special Rapporteur on the implications for human rights of the environmentally sound management and disposal of hazardous substances and wastes
address the issue of a state's duty to prevent exposure to hazardous substances within the context of the global crisis arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. This is just a small example of the Council's work, which together with the Human Development Report 2020 provides a good base of knowledge for future action. If I may, I will conclude on a personal note. As I stated earlier, I am a Fijian. I know firsthand the devastating impact that climate change is having on all human rights, be it civil, political, economic, social, or cultural rights. Tragically, last year, this fact was underlined as Fiji suffered from 2 serious tropical cyclones. What the cyclones underlined is the fact that to effectively prepare for and recover from the negative human rights impacts of climate change and other environmental risks, we must ensure that a human rights perspective is integrated into all future development actions. Only then will we be able to formulate and implement effective and ambitious development and environmental action that is grounded in the lived experiences of the most vulnerable, and especially those most affected by the consequences of climate change. I thank you very much indeed for inviting me to contribute to what is a very important discussion. Vinakavakale.
Ambassador Kamp, thank you very much for those comments, and we'll be coming back to some of those points you made a bit later with our questions. Firstly, I'd just like to remind our audience that our Q&A box is still open, so you can enter your questions there. And now we'd like to move on to hand over the floor to Stuart McKinnon from the IUCN. So I hand over the floor to you.
So thank you very much, Kazmira. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all. IUCN is delighted to be part of this launch of UNDP's Human Development Report. This year's report could not be more timely, as I think has been said already, because humanity is really struggling with the consequences of 3 converging crises on the Earth's natural and economic systems. Those crises are, I think we know, a public health crisis, a biodiversity crisis, and a climate crisis. For those of you who do not know IUCN, it's a membership union of over 1,400 state and government agency members, NGOs, and Indigenous peoples organisations. It's also got 17,000 scientists associated with the union through its scientific expert commissions. And IUCN supports the implementation of conservation and sustainable development initiatives in about 160 countries, as well as generating science and knowledge and facilitating natural resource policy and development at all levels. IUCN is a long-standing partnership with UNDP, working on issues pertaining to the conservation development nexus. While historically there has been skepticism whether conservation can be sufficiently mainstreamed into economic development, there's now a growing body of evidence that demonstrates social and economic gains can be derived with well-designed conservation initiatives. Let's take, for example, the Great Green Wall initiative, which aims to restore 100 million hectares of land across the Sahel by 2030. This initiative is projected to provide food security for 20 million people and to create 350,000 jobs, as well as sequestering 250 million tonnes of carbon. Between 2007 and 2018 alone, 18 million hectares of land was restored, generating about $90 million of benefits for local communities. And another example would be the use of mangroves. About $57 billion worth of flooding damage is averted each year in places like China, India, Mexico, US, and Vietnam that proactively use mangroves to protect coastal livelihoods and coastal communities. Now, such cases clearly demonstrate the potential for nature's role in development and have informed IUCN's definition of nature-based solutions for societal challenges, which we launched in 2016. Put simply, these are solutions that require a healthy ecosystem which can provide goods and services for people without damaging and harming nature. Following the work on the definition, IUCN undertook the development and launch of a global standard on NBS over the last couple of years. This standard now informs the design and implementation of nature-based solutions around the world with a consistency of understanding and approach. As we continue to build on this work, the UNDP Human Development Report is very timely. It echoes IUCN's message, but critically from a development perspective. And I'd really like to thank and acknowledge UNDP for highlighting and dedicating a whole chapter to highlighting the importance of nature-based solutions in namely Chapter 6. With such a convergence of ideas and evidence from both conservation and development, this is an opportune time for action. And we're taking significant steps and working together with development actors, such as yourselves, to really bring this around. At the moment, IUCN is expanding its global nature-based solutions facility, and this facility has three main functions which correspond very nicely to the report's three recommendations. Again, reflecting a convergence of ideas and priorities for action. Those three functions are a knowledge and innovation hub, really designed to help generate new science, new tools, new technology, and critically build capacity. A finance catalyst that really will be critical for generating the billions of dollars required to really put nature to work to safeguard and protect human lives and to avert future crises. And a policy enabler that really will be able to work cross-sectorally and optimize the rollout of nature-based solutions with other approaches and other technologies. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, our sincere thanks to UNDP for this excellent and reflective report and for inviting IUCN to be part of the launch. We look forward to working together in taking nature-based solutions to new heights for the benefit of people and nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. And last but not least, to provide us with a business perspective, I'd like to invite Peter Backer to share his thoughts.
Not sure you can see me, or can you?
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, can you see me now? Wait a moment. All right, well, I'll talk without showing my face then.
That's
so
great.
thank you very much. Thank you very much, and congratulations to UNDP for the Geneva launch of the Human Development Report. It's the 30th anniversary, I hear, and that's fantastic news. And as was said before, it's timelier than ever because we need to tackle inequality as it's now taking a front stage. People are dissatisfied with their own personal economic situations and do not feel optimistic about the future. Inequality has been triggering protests all around. You know, the Black Lives Matters in the US, the Gilets jaunes in France, revolts in Chile, India, and everything there is eroding trust in our key institutions and represents an increasingly significant threat to the license to operate for business and in some countries the democracy itself. COVID-19 has brought inequality further into the spotlight, feeding on it, making it impossible to ignore. In 2020, for the first time, inequality rose in every country in the world. Tackling inequality requires urgent action. Reducing it is a central part of the 2030 agenda, and it must be achieved both for the sake of inequality as well as for achieving all the other sustainable development goals. In my organization, WBCSD, we have launched Vision 2050, Time to Transform, only last week. In that work, we say that our society is facing three global pressing challenges: the climate emergency, nature loss, and inequality. So let me share my thoughts on the Human Development Report 2020, present you what human development means from a business perspective. The report is an impressive piece of work. It mobilizes human development, analyzes the collective evidence, and it suggests options for individual and collective choices on how to redress both social and planetary imbalances. Particularly interesting to business is the second part of the report that explores mechanisms of change can mobilize actions by individuals, communities, governments, civil society, and business. The two key messages in that section are important. We need a just transformation in the way we live, work, and cooperate, and we need new social norms, improved incentives, and working with instead of against nature. These messages resonate well with the work that business already does and what we see within our membership. As I mentioned, in Vision 2050, developed over the last 2 years, we see a lot of similar conclusions as in the Human Development Report 2020. The need for a long-term vision that we can all rally behind. In our case, 9+ billion people living well within planetary boundaries by mid-century is a total human-centric vision. What we need now is the concept of systems transformation, and that's crucial in both reports. Achieving these relatively simply worded visions requires a wholesale transformation of everything we've grown up with. Energy needs to decarbonize, materials need to go circular, food needs to be produced sustainably, equitably, and provide healthy diets. Everyone in sustainability is talking about systems transformation, and now more than ever we need actions to back it up. And so in Vision 2050, 9 pathways that make up system transformation that are written in an actionable way. Rightfully so, both of our reports emphasize that progress will not come about without fundamental changes to our way of thinking. In your case, the social norms as a mechanism of change. And rightfully, you note that the private sector constitutes a channel through which behavior and social norms can change. In our report, we talk about 3 mindset shifts. Reinvention, resilience, and regeneration will be critical to move from incremental change to an accelerated transformation that is needed to achieve our visions. In our belief, the most critical of these mindset shifts is one about the reinvention of capitalism. This shift will ensure that the economic system, our incentives, the global accounting standards, and the capital market valuations will no longer just be based on the financial performance of business, but integrates the impact on the planet and people as part of how we define success and determine enterprise value. To move to a capitalism of true value for all will accelerate the transformation toward this 9 billion people all living well within the boundaries of the planet. So let me conclude. Both reports emphasize that we are all change makers now. For business, this means having to play a leading role in the transformations towards our visions, together with governments, regulators, investors, and all people. It's time to transform. It's time to think systems. It's time to create true value. The Human Development Report and Vision 2050 are great resources for everybody to get started on this. And therefore, I really hope that we can count on all of you to be part of this decisive journey for our generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And before we turn to audience questions, I've got some brief follow-up questions for our panelists. If I could start with Ambassador Khan. So you mentioned in your comments just now, we've had a very busy month wrapping up the 46th National Human Rights Council, and we had over 60 nations and thousands of civil society groups who called for this universal recognition of the right to a healthy environment. and the hope being that this will lead to a resolution later this year. What would the recognition of this right and an expansion of these freedoms signify in terms of progress, and also in shifting some of the social norms that are addressed in this report?
Thank you very much for that question. If the resolution is passed in the Council, either by consensus or by a vote, and we don't know which yet, I think the consequence would be quite significant, both at a symbolic level as well as a very practical level in domestic jurisprudence. And the reason I say that it goes beyond the symbolic is because the majority of countries in the world have that right in their domestic constitutions. And as in the enforcement of that right, the fact that international law recognizes such a right, and that it is a right that is seen as a human right, would further the journey domestically and would probably strengthen the enforceability of that right domestically. It would help judiciaries to shape that right, to define it. And I think you would see an emerging trend of jurisprudence. There already is jurisprudence on the right because there's already domestic jurisdictions which include the right. But I think the fact that there is an international recognition would help to shape that right, because I think you would then find international experts helping to define what it meant in the context of other rights as a right that stands on its own. So I think it will see some very, very important developments around the world. Thank you. Over to you.
And to follow up quickly on that, can a rights-based approach to environmental protection encourage change, and should we be adopting a more rights-based approach to environmental protection?
Well, I think absolutely yes. I think you gathered that from my remarks earlier. But I think it would be impossible, I think, to approach the concept of environmental integrity and of saving our environment generally in the future unless we brought people to the center of that discussion. And I say that because I can only echo what our colleagues have said earlier, that this is really the language of empowerment. It's not just about protecting the vulnerable. It's about bringing the vulnerable to the table in the implementation of policy, in the formulating of policy, even before the implementation. I think that if you're asking those who are disproportionately impacted by the consequence of environmental degradation, what they would like to see, what changes they'd like to see, and how they can benefit from the journey that a country takes, then I think you'll find that policy will change. It will be far more integrated. It will reflect human rights at a very, very fundamental level. And I think then it would indeed be the kind of policy that you would see a continuous integration of. I give two examples. One is the effectiveness of the Sendai framework. The Sendai framework on responding to disasters was really central to bringing people into disaster response. And it's worked. For those countries which have integrated the Sendai framework into their disaster response policies, it's worked because people are at the table defining how a country responds at community level. That's very important. The second is an issue that was raised earlier about indigenous people and the importance of the links between the indigenous and their environment, and how important it is that we empower those who are the closest to the environment and who are going to be the most greatly impacted by environmental degradation. And in really listening to the indigenous communities, in ensuring that they are empowered through legislative frameworks, through discussions within a country, I think you'll find that you're bringing people to the table who have the most at stake from environmental change. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. And if I could perhaps bring Stuart McKinnon in at this point, because the report talks about nature-based solutions needing this typically bottom-up approach, often relying on the participation and initiative of Indigenous peoples and local communities. How can you describe for us what these nature-based solutions look like in practice, and also how we can go about scaling them?
Yeah, thanks very much, Casimir. I'd like to take us into a real practical example in the IUCN has worked with an IUCN state member, Rwanda, for the last decade. In 2011, Rwanda recognized that with 11 million people, and 80% of whom were rural dwellers, farming on an average area of land that was less than 0.8 of a hectare, that if they were going to become a middle-income country, they needed to invest in the land base, that the land health and its productivity was essential to that economic development trajectory. And so they made a commitment that they would restore forest cover, soil, land health, border to border. And they made a commitment over the last, since that period in time, they've invested over $600 million in different activities, primarily agroforestry, because it's a highly populated agricultural dependent country. But also protecting water courses, catchment areas, and really making and really sort of investing in that there. In doing so, they have generated about 22,000 new jobs. They have actually enhanced and safeguarded another approximately 400,000 jobs that are actually dependent on natural resources. And they have already taken action on over 700,000 hectares. That's about 35% of the land area. So that's what FLR is, that's what Nature-Based Solutions really looks like in practice. Investing in the land base, but really with a benefit for job creation, crop productivity, securing livelihoods, etc.
Thank you. And if I can turn to Peter for your thoughts. The crisis of the past year we've seen how it's hurt businesses and their employees in more ways than one. Given this urgent need to change the way we approach global development, how can companies both support these structural changes and respond to calls to protect nature while also navigating their way out of this economic crisis at the same time?
Yeah, I think what business has to do is really step up. So in business, we talk a lot about ESG. When we talk about what can businesses do to be more driving towards more sustainable performance, we really need to step up what business now does on the S of the ESG, the social agenda. So the first thing is, obviously, in the pandemic in which we still are, unfortunately, we need to make sure the health and safety of all our people, all our suppliers, and all our customers is guaranteed. Secondly, we need to ensure that we transform the way we work. I would anticipate significant changes in the use of offices and the likes. We'll see continued transformations as a result of technology moving forward, as with its limitations, given that I don't know how to switch on my camera in this system apparently. But there we need to have really responsible implementation of technology and constantly work on what is called the just transitions. It is good that we want to move from the fossil fuel-based industry to the renewable-based energy, from traditional agriculture to regenerative agriculture. But in all those decisions, we must now begin to integrate what are the implications for people. And the way to do it is to use what is called the Human and Social Capital Protocol. So many of the people on the line today will have heard of the greenhouse gas protocol, where companies are very experienced in measuring their greenhouse gas emissions. There is a similar framework called the Human and Social Capital Protocol, which determines how companies measure and manage the impact their businesses have on people, not just their own employees, the communities in which they operate, and the customers they serve. And by integrating that in the way we manage our businesses, by making that as important as the way we manage our financial performance or our environmental performance, then we will get to a decision making that will support human development, that will avoid environmental degradation, and that in the process will make sure that the value that business creates is a long-term value for all. That's really the future, and that's what we mean with a true value creation in business. Over, because you can't see me.
Thank you. I'd like to turn back to Pedro Conceição briefly as well. I mean, we've heard from the speakers there are different perspectives on how we can start changing norms and values to support both the planet and societies together.
Here the report, they can't. No.
I just wanted to ask you, I mean, the report also highlights some huge limitations that we face in trying to achieve some of these changes. And as Peter says, this systems change that we need. No country in the world has yet achieved this very high human development without putting an immense strain on the planet. My question to you is, will current institutions and systems are they equipped to produce this radical transformation needed?
Thank you, Casimira. That's a very big question. I think the honest answer is that we don't know, but it's likely that we may need quite a bit of innovation when it comes to institutions here broadly understood, not only formal institutions, but also institutions such as social norms to help us to manage the transformations that are needed. I really like Peter's mindset shift that he presented to us that came from his report, Resilience, Regeneration, and Reinvention. So as we embark on this journey of transformation, I think that what's important perhaps is to be very clear about what we want to safeguard when it comes to the outcomes that these institutions, whatever they are going to provide to all of us. And here, again, I think we can go back to the principles of the human development approach. Human rights, certainly, as a foundation. I think it's important, as Ambassador Khan emphasized, to not separate environmental degradation from human rights violations. In the report, for instance, we document that often they overlap. So we see, for instance, that in value change in the seafood industry, we see destruction of ecosystems in oceans overlapping with egregious human rights violations in forced labor, and even slave labor. It's important to recognize the interdependence of these two aspects, and again, to have institutions always very grounded on the importance of human rights. Secondly, the importance of equity. Again, it has been emphasized by everyone, and it's something central also to the human development approach. If we take just the case of the environment, we know how movements such as the environmental justice movement, for instance, have been premised on understanding and redressing some of the inequalities in the impact of environmental pollution and degradation more broadly on different groups that are persistent, even when we see improvements on average. For instance, when it comes to reductions in pollution, the incidence of pollution, the negative incidence on different groups is maintained over time in many cases. So injustices in terms of environmental degradation are not always redressed, even though we witness average improvements. And then finally, and I will conclude this point about agency, human agency. Often the narratives about what's to come appear overly deterministic, either when it comes to the role of technology or to the pressures that we're putting on our planet. But ultimately, the window is still open for us to make different choices. And if we take this human development notion of the importance of agency and seeing in people agents of change, people that can make different choices if they are given conditions to do so, I think that gives us not only a sense of hope, but provides for narratives of possibility as opposed to narratives of fear or narratives that are overly deterministic in what's to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now it's time for some questions from the audience, and I think we'll start with one from Ambassador Khan. This question comes from the ITC. How should women's equal inclusion be taken in this age of the Anthropocene? So how should women's equal inclusion, how could this be taken in this new age? And a question related to this, do you believe ecofeminism could be a way to change things and norms faster?
Okay, so these are two very big and very important questions. So let me first of all take the issue of gender equality and the relationship really with development. I think the relationship is absolutely indisputable. I don't think anybody can argue that you can leave behind 50% of the population and still aspire to development. This is impossible. This is not going to happen, and it is not happening. I think gradually the relationship between development and women's inclusion, gender equality, and gender equity have become inseparable. What is very interesting, though, is the way in which this language of gender equality has moved from a language of paternalism and of imposing gender policy on 50% of the population to involving women far more in policy making and the implementation of decisions. So I think that's a very important key, that women should be at the table. You cannot make decisions and formulate policies about women without involving women in that conversation. And the education of girls is absolutely central to the empowerment of women and to gender equity. So that, I think, is something that many communities which have been conservative in the past about gender equality, many communities are now increasingly accepting and are implementing. On the other hand, we also see that in many societies in the world, women haven't really moved at all. So it's not the time for complacency. The question about the role of women in eco-equality, I think was the term that was used. You know, as I said earlier, when you're talking about environmental policies, and you're talking about the building of a new system of environmentally respectful policy, then you cannot do this without consulting women. I'm just going to give you a very, very basic example. In the Pacific, as you know, as a result of rising sea levels, many communities have had to be moved to higher ground. And when a community in Fiji was being moved, one of the earliest communities to be moved, people forgot, when they consulted the community, people forgot to ask the women and the children. They forgot to ask the children where they wanted the school to be built, and they forgot to ask the women where they wanted the water supply to be. And of course, in that traditional environment, the women were the ones responsible for getting the water. So we learned from that. We in my country, we learned from that, and we realized that you cannot talk the language of displacement without talking to everybody. And that includes talking to women in communities where women have not traditionally had a voice. And so therefore, when we put together a displacement policy for my country, it had to specify the need to consult with women. even when this was not traditionally the case. And this means that this language of women included in this environmentally sound policy, this means this is transformative. This has the capacity of changing society, of changing cultures. And this is a very important part of this environmental journey we're on at the moment. It's supposed to be transformative. It's not business as usual. And part of this not business as usual means you don't treat women the way they have been treated in the past, where they've been ignored, they've been left out of the formulation of policy, and they're nowhere to be seen when you're implementing policy. It means really going back to the table and redrafting the way that we speak to our communities. And that must mean gender-inclusive policy. Over to you.
Thank you for those insights. And, now for a really different question. Peter Becker, I think this one will be for you. It's from a responsibility investment firm. What are the new financing models that would allow the private sector to better support the challenges highlighted in the report? Over to you.
Well, at the end of the day, I think we don't need to change the mechanisms much. We need to expand the scope of what we measure and value. That's really what it will come down to. So let's take a very simple example. If business wants to be truly serious about tackling inequality, it needs to move and make pathways towards paying a living wage, or at least a living wage, to anyone in their supply chains. That's a very radical statement in today's terms. But if you now are involved in the UN Food System Summit, to which I'm an advisor myself, there the conversation is now really shaping up of in how many years can the food system move to paying a living wage all across the supply chains. That will radically shift the way that human development will happen in a very important part of our global system. One of the core problems that we currently have is that we don't really know what we pay people across the supply chains. The data is not available. Obviously, a company in the West will know from its first tier supplier, but then tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, the data becomes less and less accurate. That's a very important thing that we need to start getting right. And that's why I said earlier, the human and social capital protocol, just like the greenhouse gas protocol when it comes to CO2 emissions, is going to be the way in which business can measure and then subsequently manage its way forward. It then needs to present that into an understandable format to its investors, to the capital markets, to which the person asking the question may probably come from. And by doing that in a standardized way, that we can compare how one company does it compared to any other business, investors can begin to differentiate where they will actually allocate their capital. That will drive money towards the companies that will make better decisions, i.e., in the example, pay living wages, and that will be the beginning of changing the systems. So that's why I said in my short introduction, moving to a true value capitalism, where not just financial, but also social and environmental performance is measured, managed, and disclosed to investors, will be the key to unlock the financial system into this development.
Thank you. And a question perhaps for all of you. How can we link the different initiatives and solutions so that they work together and not against each other? We've heard during this discussion some very different solutions and approaches, and perhaps a good question here to try and bring some of those together. So perhaps starting with you, Stuart McKinnon.
Thanks, Casimira. I think actually Peter said this in one of his earlier comments. We really do need now to start to think about taking systems approaches, and that I would say certainly from our experience, one of the first places to look at is ensuring that there is policy coherence across different sectors. Often you will actually find that environmental policy and agricultural policy and infrastructure policy all run up against each other. There's actually duplication, there is redundancy in there. Indeed, actually, if I go back to the example I was mentioning in Rwanda, part of the analysis we did in moving forward with the landscape restoration there as a nature-based solution was identifying 27 policies where you actually needed to be addressed or taken into account so that one could actually get that coherence. The second thing I think is not actually seeing these as alternatives, and this is certainly one thing we've done with nature-based solutions, is not to say nature-based solutions are an alternative to other approaches, but they're a complement. That's actually where the real strength lies when we start to bring these together. For example, a nature-based solution around, let's say, regenerative agriculture that improves soil and soil biodiversity and crop productivity, along with access to crop insurance. So these are the things that actually started to combine different technologies and solutions, I think is actually central to that. And we shouldn't start to think of these in different camps. But again, I'll return to, I think, what was a key point that Peter mentioned, really starting to think about taking a systems approach to problem solving.
Ambassador Khan, what's your kind of reaction to this word systems approach and systems transformation? How does that fit into the language that you use every day? It seems perhaps quite different to your approach to this report.
Well, it is. I mean, it's quite different from the language we use at the Human Rights Council. It's quite different from the language that's used in a number of international organizations. But I do want to say this about your opening question about coherence. I don't think there's. I don't think we can deny that in this global community that we're all part of, that we act often in silos, and that one sector often has no idea what another one does. Not long ago, I took part in a lunch where a number of international organizations were sharing what they did on climate policy. And it was extraordinary what each organization was doing. But unfortunately, that was the first we knew of it as ambassadors. We had no idea that many organizations were doing the same sort of thing with good result. So my feeling is that the report, this particular report, is an important way to advance greater coherence. And I think that also the work of the special mandate holders, which really goes across every single type of right, including environmental rights, I think that that work, together with the report that has just been launched, together with the work of other international organizations, I think this is absolutely key, because otherwise we're all working in different silos, as I've said, and we are in danger of duplicating, but we're also in danger of not helping domestic jurisdictions and countries to really integrate international policy into their systems. So I think it is a difficulty with the way that the international community has worked. We are getting there on environmental policy, I believe, but still a long way to go. But this report goes a long way in assisting towards greater coherence. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. And we're quickly running out of time, so I think we have time for a quick final question on a different topic, but a theme that kind of runs throughout all different sectors and fields. I believe this was a key focus of last year's Human Development Report, but on the topic of digital transformation, how are new technologies impacting on the capacity building of professionals and the right to access information by citizens, and also maybe shaping a new inequity gap for the digital divide? Quite a complicated question there, but perhaps, Pedro, you could kick us off.
Thank you, Casimira. Let me just go back to the previous question, if I can, just to emphasize another important dimension of coherence, which has to do with ensuring that we have international coordination also. So coherence in action across countries and jurisdictions. I'll just give one example. In the report, we give the example or the case of a country that followed restrictions on the use of fishing in the national waters because there was concerns with the depletion of a particular species, cod in this case. So there was a very strong civil society movement, a consumer response as well to not consuming locally farmed or locally fished cod. But the overall level of consumption didn't change. And what happened was that demand increased for cod fished everywhere, elsewhere. And so if we don't have coordination and coherence at this level, I think we risk not addressing once again the underlying drivers of these planetary pressures. Now, when it comes to digital technology, that was indeed something that we explored in great detail in the 2019 Human Development Report, but also in the context of the differences across people when it comes to dealing with the consequences of COVID-19 more recently. And we look in particular in the difference that it makes today in having or not having access to the internet, which was an inequality that we emphasized in the 2019 report. So for children, last year, around this time last year, when 9 out of every 10 children around the world were facing schools that were closed, access to education was essentially determined by having an internet connection where distance learning was possible. And we estimated that in low human development countries, 86% of children were effectively out of school because they did not have an internet connection, while in very high human development countries, it was only 20%. So this, for us, was a clear illustration of the importance of having this concern over equity when it comes to access to, in this case, digital technologies as something that is central to the way in which we think about digital technology, but technology more broadly going forward. Thank you.
And with just a few minutes to spare, I'd just like to give this opportunity to the speakers to offer some last words to kind of wrap up this this discussion today. Peter Bakker, if you would like to start.
Yeah, so I apologize if system transformation is a word that is not used everywhere, but we live in a time where very big solutions for these pressing issues are being designed. I'll give you an example from the food system that is being designed for the Food System Summit. Regenerative agriculture is the absolute future for the way we grow our food. What regenerative agriculture does, it will sequester carbon into the soil. As a result of that, the soil will grow in biodiversity. As a result of that, the yields will go up of the crops that farmers produce, and therefore their livelihood, their income will go up. And that's what we mean with system solutions. We shouldn't just focus on inequality or just focus on climate. We should look for synergetic solutions that can cover all three of our pressing challenges. And if we do that, you'll see an enormous acceleration in the take-up.
Thank you. And Stuart McKinnon, if you'd like to add that.
Well, I'll just follow on from Peter, because I'll say it's not just that the opportunities that systems approach would take, and actually thinking about how these link up together, but also the risks of not actually looking at that. And the very fact is, what we've seen in the past when we've tried to solve one problem is that you create several others. So we may boost crop productivity, but you've also driven land degradation as well. You've enhanced inequality between different, with small farmers and large farmers. And so really being able to look and understand how these things work together, as Peter described, not only is required to seize the opportunity, but also to avoid the mistakes of the past.
Thank you, and Ambassador Khan, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think what I would like to say in conclusion is that we are all forced now to redesign our world because of COVID-19, and to really think about how we're going to pick up the pieces after this crisis. And it would be an extraordinary lost opportunity if we didn't accept the fact that this transformation included and must be based on a far more inclusive approach to policy making, a very equal approach to implementing policy, and very importantly, to accept that human rights cannot be excluded from any stream of life. It really is the key to development. Over to you. Thank you.
Big thank you to all of you for taking part today in this panel and sharing those thoughts on how we can be agents for change going forward. And I'd like to extend those thanks to the audience as well, and for your excellent questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them today, but you can continue sending those to the UNDP. And a reminder that you can find the report on the UNDP website too. And with no further ado, I'd like to wish you all a great rest of day and a very good evening.